Hi, I'm Olivia Munson, and for my project, I decided to choose artists that gave hope to the hopeless in Latin America, Spain, and beyond in their different fields. Many artists in times of struggle in society include depictions of that struggle in their works, and I decided to analyze a few that I found inspiring. I think it is very admiring that these artists use their fame to be a voice for everyday common people, not only the upper class elite. The first artist that I decided to analyze is Diego Rivera, who was a painter and grew up in Mexico and sought to make art that reflected the lives of the Mexican people. Much of his paintings were inspired by the political ideals of the Mexican Revolution in 1915 and 1916, and he wanted to make art that reflected the lives of the working class. His mentality was that everyone should be able to enjoy art, not only those who can go and enjoy it in a museum. He began to build large murals on public buildings for all to see, and his first mural was called The Creation, and it was constructed in 1922 and was the first important mural of the 20th century. As you can see, he had a great use of color. It was very vibrant. At the top of the painting is a symbol that represents the Divine Trinity with blessing hands. Also, it includes the old Egyptian idol of Anton, which represents the creative sun. In addition, he includes some Christian values. This painting does not include political or ideology tendencies, which differ from most of his works. In 1932, which was at the height of the Great Depression, he was commissioned in the United States to paint a mural, and it was in Detroit, and it was to be dedicated to the American worker. Rivera completed it in 1933, and his piece focused on industrial workers, concentrated on the car plant workers of Detroit. At this time, he was known as a communist and visited Russia to show support for the revolution. Despite his beliefs and the controversies that this mural created, it remains today as one of his most famous pieces in the United States, mostly because it was defended by Henry Ford. However, the Rockefellers did not defend him like they did in Detroit. He was commissioned to paint a mural for the Rockefeller Center in New York City, and the theme of the piece was to depict the social, industrial, political, and scientific possibilities of the 21st century, and it was to be called A Man at a Crossroads. Rivera included the Russian communist leader Vladimir Lenin, which was not approved by the Rockefeller family, and it depicted Lenin joining hands with a black farmer, white worker, and a soldier. This representation was to show anti-capitalism, which was not accepted at all in the United States at the time. But Diego refused to change his piece, so Nelson Rockefeller ordered him to stop and dismissed him. Within an hour it was covered and soon destroyed, only having a few pictures taken secretly, and this is a sketch of what it was going to be, but he never was able to finish it. So in Mexico, he recreated the piece, calling it The Man, Controller of the Universe. It caused great controversy, but is still there today. Throughout the course of his life as a painter, he stayed faithful to his Mexican people, and he remained central to Mexico in the art scene until his death and beyond. Despite at times his way of expressing his opinion backfired on him, such as the Rockefeller fresco, Rivera included important political views that were relevant to the common person. By involving those who were in poverty in his well-known paintings, he gives hope and respect to them all. Next, I analyzed the writer Pablo Neruda, who grew up in Chile in a small town called Tumaco. Many of his childhood memories came from a town that was untouched by social and religious conventions. Neruda was a poet that had a great sense of self-criticism in his life. But he also had a great faith in his poetry, but this did not come from himself or the great poems that he wrote, but from the fact that ordinary, common people appreciated his works. In 1936, during the beginning of the Civil War, when the people of Spain were putting up heroic resistance against the fascist forces, Neruda could not remain silent. He quickly became involved in the struggle, first as a consul, and he helped people whose lives was in danger to migrate out of Spain, but for this effort he was dismissed from his post. Despite this, he continued to help those in need and became one of the most ferocious poets, speaking out against the cruel events that were unfolding in Spain at the time. During this in Madrid, Neruda found himself involved in a group of poets who maintained special social relationships with the common people. Some of these poets included Lorca, Alberto Miguel Hernandez, Luis Sonduda, and Leon Felipe. Many of these poets were the ones that introduced him into politics, and one of his closest friends in this picture was Federico Lorca. One of his most famous poems during this time was called I'm Explaining a Few Things, and here are a few pictures of that poem. Some lines that stood out to me are at the end, and it says, I'll tell you all the news. I lived in a suburb of Madrid with bells and clocks and trees. And you will ask, why doesn't his poetry speak of dreams and leaves and great volcanoes, of his native land? Come and see the blood in the streets. Come and see the blood in the streets. Come and see the blood in the streets. These poems talked about the reality of the war at the time, and was what many of the people needed to hear. He gave hope to the common people by being on their side and speaking up in his works. Neruda changed his perspective of poetry from being something private to being something that was a form of expression that must be shared. In 1945, Neruda joined the Communist Party of Chile and was elected senator in the same year. His involvement with workers and ordinary people increased greatly, but his criticism of the ruling class also increased during this time, which led to threats of his arrest, and finally he was forced to go into hiding. He was hidden by workers and had to move from house to house. During this time, he spent a lot of time writing a collection of poems called Canto General. These poems were published in 1950 and became very well known quickly. They told the story of the Latin American person, and these poems represented many of the workers and peasants Neruda came to know. In many of these poems, the messages Neruda was trying to convey came from what was going on at the time and how to perceive the present. Later in his life, he became more aware of his language that he used in his poems, and he decided he wanted to have a better structure for his audience, who were the common people and were often illiterate and uninformed. In this poem, Ode to My Socks, he uses a short, irregular lines of free verse, and it is told in the first person by a common, unnamed man about receiving an ordinary object, socks. He describes the most extraordinary aspects in life can appear in everyday ordinary situations to ordinary people. Ultimately, anyone could connect to this poem because everyone can apply the message of the poem, which was to try and enjoy the little things in life. Next, I decided to analyze the tango, which started in the late 1800s when millions of European immigrants arrived in Rio de la Plata in South America in the cities of Montevideo, Uruguay, and Buenos Aires, Argentina. The majority of the immigrants were Italian and Spanish, many being single young men looking to make a living in South America. Many brought their music, such as the violin, the flamenco guitar, and the bandoneon, and also their dances, the waltz, the mazurka, and the polka. They mixed them all with the Argentina folk music and dance, as well as with Cuban habanera and the African rhythms from the freed slave celebrations. The tango dance arose in waterfront areas from this mix of cultures, becoming a mating dance between barmaids and their customers in not the best kind of neighborhoods. The tango dance soon was shunned by the upper class and middle classes in society, especially Argentina. It became a sleazy fixture of urban nightlife in Buenos Aires. But Carlos Gardel changed this. He became a popular tango singer and dancer at the time, and he helped popularize the style as it moved from the underground dance salons to the upper classes. He grew up singing in local restaurants, bars, and markets, and he became a symbol of an immigrant who triumphs. Gardel revolutionized what tango was. It was originally only made of instruments, but with his performance of Mi Noche Triste, or My Sad Night, he added words to tango. Here's a recording of that song.
Hasta que me abraces en lo mejor de mi vida, dejándome la alma herida y espina en el corazón, sabiendo que te quería, que vos eras mi alegría y mi sueño abrazador. Para mí ya no hay consuelo y por eso me engordé por olvidarme de tu amor. Cuando voy a mi cotorro, lo veo de sangre nueva, todo triste y abandonado.
This song is a classic tango story of a man wishing for a woman who rejected him. The song was sentimental and romantic, which captured the feeling of Buenos Aires itself. In 1930s, Gardel brought tango to the rest of the world, accompanied with Argentina's best guitarists. He went on tour to South America, France, and the United States. He became even more popular when he starred in Spanish-language movies. Gardel was unlike many singers of his time because Gardel was and still idolized by all, regardless of social, geographical, or generational differences. He was known as the creator of tango and is still praised today. His way of tango helped the marginalized become accepted by high society all over the world. Overall, these artists helped to give hope to the hopeless, especially in Latin America and Spain. They used their popularity to make a difference in paintings, poetry, and song. If it weren't for these artists, many common, ordinary people would not have the hope and voice they did at the time. Here's my works cited, and thank you for listening.